So today, once again, we're looking at Jacob Rees-Mogg, but not so much Jacob Rees-Mogg himself, but more we're looking at what his dad did, because his dad wrote a book, which pretty much sums up not only Jacob Rees-Mogg and how he acts, and how, especially now that the ERG pretty much is the Conservative Party, but also sums up, once again, what these plans are for the future of Britain. And I tell you now, they're not going to be good. They're not what anyone ideally voted for, anything of the sort. But so anyway, this comes from, again, The Guardian covered this. So, how to explain Jacob Rees-Mogg. Start with his father's books. In the spring of 1997, shortly before Tony Blair took power, William Rees-Mogg, the ex-editor of The Times and leading Eurosceptic, pinstriped self-publicist and father of Jacob, published a book that claimed to see the future of the world. It was called The Sovereign Individual, The Coming Economic Revolution and How to Survive and Prosper in It. And it opened with a quote from Tom Stoppard's play Arcadia: "The future is disorder." For 380 breathless pages, Lord Rees-Mogg and co-author James Dale Davidson, an American investment guru and conservative propagandist, predicted that the digital technology would make the world hugely more competitive and unequal and unsustainable. Societies would splinter, taxes would be evaded, government would gradually wither away, and by 2010 thereabouts, he said, they wrote, welfare states would become simply undefensible. In such a harsh world, only the most talented, self-reliant and technologically adept person, the sovereign individual, would thrive. The book's a mixture of gloom and glee, the air of the patrician certainty, and it didn't go down well with British reviewers in 1997. The West was entering a period of relative prosperity, equality and political optimism. With the rise of Blair, it personified that age. The book seemed far too apocalyptic. Besides, Rees-Mogg had been making melodramatic predictions in newspaper columns for decades. So many had been wrong. Colin Powell would be the first black president of the United States. Margaret Thatcher would survive the 1990 coup against her. The Private Eye called him Mystic Mogg after the astrologer Mystic Meg. When he died in 2012, the obituaries were more respectful, concentrating instead on his many years of smoothly ascending the service and servicing the establishment. They only briefly mentioned The Sovereign Individual and the handful of other equally strange, ambitious Rees-Mogg volumes that preceded it, without making much of an effort what the books were about. His career as an author, the obituaries discreetly implemented that they had been an insignificant sideline or a bit of an embarrassment. Their verdict is now being seemed a bit premature. In August, Alistair Campbell, Blair's former right-hand man and a prominent Remainer, wrote about The Sovereign Individual at length on his blog. He called it the most important book you have never heard of. After reading it, he intriguingly claimed, "It's easy to see why Jacob so loves Brexit and the chaos and disorder and opportunities for disaster capitalism and the super elite and for the super elite it may provide." Across the Atlantic, the book has become associated with another disruptive tendency in modern politics, the right-wing libertarians of Silicon Valley. From the start, the book was better received in the US, where futurology and the polemics against the state are more mainstream genres. In 2011, almost a decade and a half after the book's publication, Rees-Mogg was still being invited there to talk about it to students at Stanford University, on one of Silicon Valley's prime recruiting grounds. In 2014, Peter Thistle, the intellectually fiercely the conservative co-founder of PayPal, told businesses and magazines and Forbes itself that the sovereign individual had influenced him more than any other book. As well as an air of rhetoric about the internet's revolutionary potential, already standard stuff for futurologists in the mid-90s, the book contains more concrete pioneering predictions about cryptocurrencies, electronic welfare, smartphones, and the possibility of online bots imitating humans. Some of these forecasts had an accuracy that still amazes Rees-Mogg and Davidson envisaged. A new digital form of money, for example, to consist of encrypted sequences, unlike unique and anonymous and verifiable, tradable at a keystroke in a multi-trillion-dollar wholesale market without borders. Bitcoin, in other words, a decade before it was actually invented. The book also foresaw a backlash against the footloose cosmopolitan elites the digital technology would help create. The economy's losers, as Jacob Rees-Mogg and Davis called them, who do not excel in problem solving or possess globally market skills, would turn to nationalism and bitter nostalgia. They would seek to thwart the movement of capital and people across borders. In today, the more than ever connected, ever more fragmented world, Mystic Mogg appears to be having the last laugh. He was 68 when the book came out. The long, sometimes erratic, rarely examined intellectual journey that led up to it tells us important things about the transatlantic conservatism over the last half a century, and how drastically it has changed. Rees-Mogg's journey also helps us explain an increasingly powerful but still quite opaque son, Jacob, not just as a supporter of Brexit, but as an unmissable and nimble sovereign individual, the exact type his father envisaged. Simultaneously, Rees-Mogg Jr. has managed to be a successful player in the modern borderless frictional industries and a nationalist politician with an instantly recognisable retro image. He has seduced some Labour MPs with his old-fashioned mannerisms, and he is met privately in a Mayfair hotel with the would-be guru of the international far right, Steve Bannon. This lack of squeamishness about how the conservative establishment holds on to political and economic power has been passed down the Rees-Mogg generations. As Jacob told the Times in 2015, my father, with who I discussed all aspects of politics and finance, was the greatest influence on my professional life. William Rees-Mogg was born in 1928. His father was a Somerset landowner, and his mother an American actor. From a young age, William, like Jacob, combined foggishness and loved double-breasted suits and old books, with a modern expertise at self-promotion. A high-profile undergraduate at Oxford, he told an interviewer from the student magazine ISIS that he read the Financial Times every morning and was hired by that paper shortly afterwards. After failing twice to be elected as a Conservative MP in the 50s, he settled for achieving political influence by journalistic means, becoming an editor of the Times in 1967. At that time, then the precious age of 39, over his 14 years in the post, he grew steadily more right-wing. During the 60s, he was a relatively egalitarian Tory, arguing that in a party pamphlet that it is reasonably to encourage employees to identify themselves within a company by having some small share holding in it, and an approach to capitalism being promoted by the Shadow Chancellor John Macdonald. But by the mid-70s, the West's post-war economic boom and the political consequences were coming to an end, and Rees-Mogg joined the swelling ranks of right-wing doommongers. In 1974, he spent his August family holiday hastily writing a book called Rewriting Error: The Crisis of World Inflation. Its tone was both grand and panicky. Inflation is a disease of indoctrination, he wrote. His readiness to generalize and use obscurousness, archaic language, was something which, with readers of his books and followers of Jacob's pronouncements, would be very familiar. There were other such diseases, Rees-Mogg continued, Anarchy and Tyranny, Cancer. He argued that economic order could be restored by giving gold a central role in the world economy, a policy that had been out of fashion for decades. He also advocated monetarism and restricting the supply of money, a new idea that was becoming popular on the British right, which would be adopted by Thatcher as a premier with a mixed economic and devastating social consequences. Rees-Mogg supported his arguments with a teetering pile of references from, among other fields, history, philosophy, psychoanalysts, and nuclear physics. The overall effect was uneven. The fluent, entitled assertiveness of the Times leading article awkwardly mixed up with a more personal tone, digressive, a little amateurish. But Rees-Mogg was not put off. He was confident, not especially continuous newspaper editor, rarely in the office after 6:30. 3 years further into his tenure, in 1977, he found the time to produce another sweeping book about a grandiose title, An Humbler Heaven, about his keen Roman Catholicism and the value of religion in general. Again, he was preoccupied by the need to bring order to a supposedly chaotic present. A world which has lost his faith, he wrote, is like a drowning man, desperately thrashing around. 4 years later, in 1981, he seemed to underline his opposition to the unruly forces of modernity by stepping down as Times editor shortly after Rupert Murdoch became the proprietor. Yet, behind the showy Rees-Mogg reverence for rules and tradition, there has lurked a more hard-nosed impulses. He had inherited money from his parents, and had always been interested in the stock market. After leaving the Times, he met with Davidson by chance, at the home of a mutual friend in Oxford. They quickly found that they agreed, and Rees-Mogg wrote in his memoirs on the importance of low taxation and personal independence from government, the two sacred causes of the radical right wing at the time and since. In 1983, the two men set up a company to publish a newsletter, The Strategic Investment. It used their knowledge, or the knowledge they assumed they had, of history, business, and social trends to offer long-term advice to wealthy investors. Rees-Mogg made each of his children a stakeholder. Jacob was only just a teenager, but he was already eagerly managing his own share portfolio, to the delight of the right-wing press. In 1987, Davidson and Rees-Mogg expanded some of their newsletter material into a book, Blood in the Streets: Investment Profits in a World Gone Mad. Its message was summed up by a quote from a 19th century financial trader, Nathan Rothschild. The best time to buy is when blood is running in the streets. The book's prose was equally blunt, broken up into bite-sized chunks with grabbing headlines, as if to catch the attention of the time-poor plutocrats. The world is getting more dangerous by the day, a typical sentence announced. Another advised, you should probably hold on to some gold. In 1992, the preface to another lurid Rees-Mogg and Davidson volume, The Great Reckoning: How the World Will Change Before the Year 2000, Rees-Mogg revealed that he had not written either book. My contribution, he said, has included ideas, continued discussion between us, as well as the discovery of relevant books. Since 1981, he had owned an antiquarian bookshop in London, Pickering and Chatto. Yet, whether his exact role in the collaborations, and judging by how many of his favourite historical figures and hobby horses appeared, it was substantial. His worldview had clearly shifted. Instead of warning against social and economic turmoil as a threat to conservatism and the well-off, he now saw an opportunity for them. After the millennium, many British and US right-wingers would follow him down that risky path. Jacob is not much of a writer. He has produced no books. He's probably too busy with politics and his business career, but his father's impact on his thinking and behaviour is obvious once you know what to look for. In 2012, 2 years after becoming an MP, he contributed a short, rather stiff introduction to an essay collection published by the right-wing think tank Proletheia. He wrote that it was for the individual against the state and against a society wrapped in cotton wool. The choice, he concluded, is between the collective against the current mediocrity, and freedom and great perks of human endeavour. The world agreed for personal success, a world arranged for personal success above all. In 1997, the sovereign individual, Rees-Mogg Sr., recommended Singapore to readers who were entrepreneurs as one of several countries that, quote, impose low costs on businesses. The book also advised readers to use tax havens. So you can see where we're going. As we've said before, this idea of making Britain a Singapore is going to be great for people like Jacob Rees-Mogg who have all this money. But for everyone else, and for the hundreds and thousands of people who voted for Brexit, not so much. So, use of tax havens. So in 2007, after studying history at Oxford like his father, Rees-Mogg founded Somerset Capital Management, a classical Rees-Mogg mixture of the cosy and the calculating, which has since become a highly profitable London company investing money for clients in emerging markets, such as Southeast Asia. The company also operates from Singapore and has subsequently and has a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands that are both tax havens. This Somerset Capital opened two funds for investors in Ireland only a few months after one of its prospectuses warned that investments in Britain may be affected by considerable uncertainty around Brexit, a possibility that as a politician Jacob always plays down. Accused of hypocrisy and unpatriotic behaviour, he insisted that these Irish ventures had nothing whatsoever to do with Brexit and were simply a response to interest from clients. Unlike his listed father, Jacob has used the politician's ability to say as little as possible when necessary, and thus close awkward issues down. He also has a sly way with threats and euphemisms that our insidious father did not possess. In September, amid rumours of an imminent leadership challenge to Theresa May, Jacob told the website Politics Home, "She is a fanciful, dutiful Prime Minister, and she has my support. I just wanted to change one item of policy," by which he meant her entire Brexit approach. 2 decades after the sovereign individual prophesied that the 21st century that many of the ablest people would use clear-headed cost-benefit analysis to assess what was in their best interest, they would cease to think of themselves as a party to a nation. That may be something for patriotic Brexit supporters and the rest of us to ponder if we were to get a Rees-Mogg Prime Minister. And that's certainly one thing that, quite frankly, we do not want.